Hi, I'm Steve Boilard with the California Legislative Analyst's Office, and this is my colleague Judy Heiman. We've just released a report entitled Improving Higher Education Oversight that responds to the recent closure of the California Post-Secondary Education Commission, or CPAC, which had been the state's designated higher education coordinating agency. The report explains the events surrounding how CPAC was eliminated. It presents a conceptual model for how the state can reestablish and improve higher education oversight, and it offers specific short and long-term recommendations. So Judy, can you tell us how CPAC came to be eliminated?
Governor Brown eliminated CPAC's state funding in the 2011-12 state budget. In his veto message, he said that he believed CPAC had been ineffective. In fact, that's been a common complaint in recent years, and there have been several proposals to reform or replace CPAC. The governor simply eliminated its funding without replacing it, but in his veto message, he also acknowledged the importance of coordinating and guiding higher education policy and asked stakeholders to explore other ways of accomplishing that.
So then what happened to the duties that CPAC had been performing?
Two key functions were transferred to other agencies. CPAC had administered a federal grant to improve teaching in K-12 schools, and that program is now continuing under the wing of the California Department of Education. The other key function that's continuing is CPAC's role as a clearinghouse for post-secondary information in California. And most people would agree that this was the most valuable service CPAC has performed in recent years. CPAC had assembled extensive data resources, including individual student records across segments and across time, as well as publicly available information from sources such as the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And they'd been able to put these data together in useful ways and make them available to policymakers and the public in various forms, including through customized reports on their website. CPAC transferred this data warehouse to the California Community College's Chancellor's Office.
So there's been a lot of interest in that particular aspect about data. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. The data that were publicly available are still there on CPAC's same internet address, thanks to the community colleges. But there are a number of legal issues related to federal and state privacy laws, as well as some policy concerns regarding control of the data. In the past, CPAC was able to use its data to conduct policy studies and to provide access to independent policy researchers. The segments contend that now that CPAC is no longer there, any researchers or policy analysts who wish to conduct studies have to get their explicit permission. So for example, if we wanted to do a study of community college transfer outcomes before and after the state's Transfer Reform Act, we would need to get permission from each of the three public segments. We think there's a potential conflict of interest in relying on the segments for permission to use the data to study their performance and that of their students. In the report, we suggest a number of alternatives for housing the data, but ultimately we believe that it really needs to be maintained by an independent authority separate from the segments.
So what about the other functions that CPAC had been carrying on beyond these Judy described?
Other functions have been discontinued, leaving a vacuum in some areas. The segments have stepped in to assume some of the functions that CPAC had performed. For example, the California State University Board of Trustees is revising its comparison groups for executive compensation. In the past, CPAC was responsible for assembling the comparison groupings using a methodology that had been agreed upon by the administration and the legislature and the segments. The CSU's methodology differs from that which had been agreed upon. Another example, as we've been discussing, is that the segments have assumed control over access to the intersegmental data. While it can be helpful that the segments are filling in some of these areas, it also raises concerns about how they balance their own institutional interests with the public interest. And really, it's not their job to be looking after the state's interests. Instead, they focus on their progress as institutions. So this really points to the need for independent oversight to look after the public interest.
So what would that independent oversight look like?
We see oversight as a process that enables policymakers and others to monitor how effectively and efficiently post-secondary education system is meeting the state's needs and to make changes to improve its performance. This requires first identifying the state's needs and priorities, which is not always easy given the complexity and multiple missions of higher education. In the report, we suggest several ways the legislature could approach this. Then, the key is linking those needs and priorities to policy decisions. This diagram illustrates how the legislature could accomplish this. The process involves systematically collecting data on performance related to the state's priorities, independently assessing those data, recommending policy changes based on the analysis, modifying policies and funding to better align the performance of the higher education system with the state's needs, and periodically reviewing goals, indicators, and targets to reflect changing priorities, technology, and expectations. State policymakers, the segments, institutions, and other stakeholders all have distinct roles in overseeing post-secondary education. The governor and legislature establish the state's expectations. The segment governing boards are responsible for aligning their programs with those expectations, and the oversight process helps to ensure that alignment.
So the state defines what the objectives are, while the segments are able to figure out how to achieve them.
Exactly. I think policymakers are wise to avoid being too prescriptive about how the segments meet those objectives. Instead, they could allow them some flexibility and hold them accountable for outcomes rather than the process.
So what can the state do in order to achieve this kind of oversight mechanism that you've described?
The report goes into some detail about how to move forward. It boils down to formalizing the policy process we've been discussing, starting with identifying the state's needs and priorities and creating an independent oversight body that can perform some of those steps that require independent analysis and expertise.
But given that the governor has just eliminated the state oversight agency, it seems like it would be pretty difficult to reestablish a new one right now.
Yes, and recognizing that, we made a number of short-term recommendations for the legislature to improve oversight in the interim. These include amending statute to ensure that the data resources remain available to policymakers and researchers, with appropriate privacy protections, of course, and taking a more active role for the legislature in monitoring higher education activities until the structure is in place for oversight of outcomes.
So it sounds like the disruption created by CPACs' demise really creates opportunities for the state to come back and establish a better higher education oversight mechanism.
I think that's exactly right. These recommendations could help to improve oversight in the short term. They could also provide an opportunity for the legislature to finally establish an effective, outcome-oriented process to improve the performance of the higher education system in meeting California's needs.
Thanks, Judy. Our entire report is available on our website. Judy and I would be happy to receive any feedback about the report or to answer any questions. Our contact information is available on our website. Thank you for listening.